Okay, great. Well, my name's Nico, and my thesis is on the effect of remote work on perceived supervisor support and effective organizational commitment. So, before the COVID-19 pandemic that we currently find ourselves in, remote working structures were not particularly popular, mainly due to some of the stigma that's behind them, of the idea that if you have an employee working remotely, they're less likely to be developing that sort of emotional connection with an organization, less likely to connect with coworkers, supervisors, and possibly even less efficient at their job. These are some of these sort of stigma and stereotypes that come along with remote working structures. So when the pandemic hit, all of a sudden everyone finds themselves, organizations and individuals find themselves in a situation where they are forced to remain in their homes. So now organizations had to ask themselves, how do we continue to operate in this very strange time? So remote working kind of gave the answer to that. But once everyone got settled into that remote working structure, now the question became, okay, how does this new working dynamic affect how the employees interact and connect with their supervisors and their organization as a whole? So, for this reason, I wanted to examine the relationship that exists between perceived supervisory support and effective organizational commitment, while examining how time spent working remotely for employees affects that dynamic as well. Now, perceived supervisory support, or PSS, as I'm going to refer to it throughout this presentation, refers to the perception that employees tend to develop concerning the level at which they believe their supervisors value their contributions and care about their well being. Really goes into how employees interpret their supervisor, how much time and effort, energy that the supervisor is investing into that employee, both for their professional and personal lives. So, previous research will tell us that some antecedents of PSS are things such as the general emotions felt at work, whether they're positive or negative. If they're positive ones, they tend to have higher levels of PSS. Negative emotions tend to lead to lower levels of PSS felt by the employee. Access to information, opportunities, and level of trust. Lower levels of access to information and lower levels of trust felt by the employee tend to lead to lower levels of PSS as well. Research will also tell us that some consequences of perceived supervisory support are things such as higher work engagement, higher retention rates, and higher levels of general psychological hardiness when it comes to both dealing with stress in the workplace as well as adaptability in the workplace as well. So that's BSS. But effective organizational commitment now, or AOC, is described as employees' attitudes towards the organization, consisting of strong belief in, acceptance of the organization's goals, a willingness to consider considerable effort on behalf of that organization, and a strong desire to maintain membership in that organization as well. Really, it goes into the emotional side of their commitment toward the organization, how much they feel that they are a part of the organization just as much as the organization is a part of them, and that they are an important facet of that organization overall. So, previous research will tell us that some antecedents of AOC, things such as role scope, job ambiguity, and personal importance. Now, this really kind of goes into um, how much the employee believes that what they do is important and vital for the organization as a whole. If they believe that what they do has a strong influence on people around them, on the organization, on what it produces, then they're going to tend to have higher levels of effective organizational commitment. Whereas if their own role within the organization it feels a little vague and feels like it doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things, then they may be likely to have lower levels of AOC. The same research will tell us that higher levels of effective organizational commitment tend to decrease intentions to quit, decrease withdrawal behaviors, as well as decrease work personal life conflicts. Now, previous research that's been done since the early 2000s will tell us that these two variables have a relationship with each other, where it's a positive correlation. So, the higher levels of perceived supervisory support that an employer will feel will tend to lead to them feeling higher levels of effective organizational commitment and vice versa. Now, when it comes to remote work being a practice of employee working at their home or in some other location that is not the organization's usual place of business. When it comes to research on remote work, it is a bit more limited, partially, possibly due to the fact that there's a lot of stigma, like I mentioned before, a lot of stereotypes that come with remote working structures. So it hasn't been delved into as deeply as the other two variables that we examined before. But from what research does exist, we can see that some antecedents of remote work, rather, are factors such as advancements in technology. The more accessible technology is for us, the easier it's becoming to create these structures where we can work remotely, or at least have the option to. Cost of work location. So it may not be fully cost effective to have all the employees coming in every day to a work location to perform their duties. When you could have some of them work partially remotely, working from home, well, then now the organization is saving money, as well as the third point there, personal needs of the employee. These speak more toward those special circumstances where if an employee had, to whatever reason, leave the state for a few months to stay with family, instead of having that employee go on an extended leave or possibly even quit, then there's a third option of working remotely for the time being. So those are speaking toward those very special, unique circumstances. Now, going into consequences of remote work, this is when it becomes very apparent how limited research on remote work is. Because for the first bullet point here, for flexible working hours and locations, that's where all research tends to agree. That's basically the definition of what remote working it means. The second two bullet points, I put asterisks next to those because this is when research tends to contradict each other. Now, some research will tell us that for employees that work remotely, they will tend to experience higher levels of social and professional isolation and have higher levels of work family conflicts. And they would theorize that this is due to the fact that, well, if you're interacting with your supervisors and coworkers only virtually, then you're going to feel that little bit of disconnect from those individuals. And since you're working from home, now the line between your work time and family time has become blurred, which can cause an increase in those conflicts. However, just almost just as many research articles will tell us that the opposite may be true. That for those working remotely, for work family conflicts, those will actually decrease. Or since you're working from home, you're able to interact and deal with any family issues that come up while you're working and be able to balance the time more efficiently. And they find that there is no difference between working remotely or non remotely in terms of feelings of social or professional isolation. So, again, just emphasizing the fact that research on remote work is quite limited and it needs to be further examined going forward in the future, especially now that we are in a time when almost everyone is working remotely. So, with all of this previous research examined, I came up with two hypotheses going into this study. First, being that perceived supervisor support will be positively related with effective organizational commitment. I'm not expecting any surprises here. Previous research, like I mentioned, since the early 2000s have shown that there is a positive relationship existing between the two factors. What I really want to examine is the second hypothesis, which is the ratio of work performed by an employee remotely compared to non remotely will have a moderating effect on the correlation between perceived supervisory support and effective organizational commitment. I really just want to see what effect remote working has on that dynamic between the two, PSS and AOC. Now, in terms of getting participants for this study, everyone needed to be over the age of 18, so a working age, and everyone needed to be working at least 30 hours per week. I chose this as the cutoff because I wanted to focus on those working more full-time hours, since those who would work part-time would tend to already have lower levels of commitment since they are either working part-time because they're working a second job or they're currently going to school or just have other general responsibilities they're taking care of throughout their time. So I wanted to focus on those individuals that were working full-time that had more of an opportunity to develop that commitment in the first place for a singular organization. Now, to get these participants, I used convenience sampling, utilizing social media posts, professional and personal networking, a lot of emails, a lot of text messages, a lot of reminders. Once that was dried out, then I utilized a paid online survey taking service to fill in the rest of the participants from there. In total, at the end, I ended up with 397 participants, 10 of which had to be removed for validity's sake. Some of the responses were incoherent or missing responses, or just apparent that the questions were not read before answered. So after those 10 were removed, I was left with 387 participant data to be utilized for this survey. Now the survey itself was utilized from a Google Forms survey, split into three basic parts to measure the three variables. The first to measure PSS was the short version of Survey of Perceived Supervisor Support, coined by Eisenberger in 2002. This consisted of 5 items, all measured on a 5-point scale, ranging from 1 being strongly disagree to 5 being strongly agree. We can see some examples below there. My supervisor takes pride in my accomplishments, and my supervisor cares about my well-being. The second part to measure AOC was the Affective Commitment Scale, coined by Allen and Meyer in 1990. This consisted of 8 items, again, measured on a 5-point scale, 1 being strongly agree, 5 strongly agree, or sorry, 1 being strongly disagree, 5 being strongly agree. That's important to note. Examples below here again. I really feel that the organization's problems are my own, and I enjoy discussing my organization with people outside of it. Now, for the third part, to measure time spent working remotely, these 3 items were created specifically for this survey. The first question being, in general, what percentage of your job is performed remotely during this time of the COVID pandemic? Second, this week, what percentage of your job was or will be done remotely? And third, next week, what percentage of your job will be done remotely? These are all fill in the blank response and questions. Now, I chose to use the 3 items instead of just asking one. That would ask, in general, how much time is spent working remotely, because I wanted to avoid any sort of over or under exaggerations of responses here. So by asking first in general, and then this week, how much time do you spend working remotely? And next week, how much time do you have scheduled to work remotely? The idea is to get the participants to think a bit more critically about exactly how much time they factually spend working in a remote situation, so that the average of these would come up to the most accurate response we could possibly get. Now, the results from this data collected, we can see here in the table of correlations. Now, first of all, we can see there is a significantly positive correlation between perceived supervisor support and effective organizational commitment, which is backed up by the previous research done since the early 2000s. So on a good track so far. When it comes to remote work, we see a slight positive correlation with both perceived supervisor support and effective organizational commitment separately, a 0.1 correlation between remote work and PSS, and a 0.11 correlation between remote work and AOC. The next 2 rows speak more toward the demographics of those surveyed rather than the results themselves. Age and gender. The age, the participants tended to be on the younger side. The average age was 27.5. And gender, the majority of participants were male, about 65.2% were male. Now, this table shows us the any sort of moderating effect that might exist that remote work would have on the relationship between perceived supervisor support and effective organizational commitment. The red solid line is 1 standard deviation above the average of time spent working remotely. The green dotted line is 1 standard deviation below the average of those spending working remotely. And we can see from this graph here that they are very, very similar, almost exactly parallel to each other. So what this tells us is that regardless of how much time is spent working remotely, there is a positive correlation that exists between PSS and AOC. Now, this all means that my first hypothesis is supported, that there is a relationship between PSS and AOC. My second hypothesis, though, is not supported. It's still important to note that this is very beneficial for the future of remote work, since we're saying that even regardless of whether the position is made a remote one or a non-remote one, as long as employees are supplied with this proper support from their supervisor team that they need, then they're able to experience just as much effective commitment as someone who is working non-remotely. Now, what does this mean for organizations? Basically, what I said, there's main 2 takeaways from this. That regardless of a non-remote or remote position, as long as the employee is provided with the proper support from their supervising team, possibly even their organization, that they are capable of experiencing those higher levels of effective commitment, the emotional connection for that organization. Great news for any organizations looking into the possibilities of utilizing remote work in the future, even once the pandemic ends. The second takeaway from this study would be that time spent working remotely was slightly positively correlated with perceived supervisor support and effective organizational commitment separately. So what the study found was that the more time that employees spent working remotely, the higher levels of PSS and AOC they experienced. This could possibly be due to the fact that we are in a pandemic and you just feel generally safer being able to work from home and just being given the opportunity by your organization to be working in safety from your home rather than having to come into an office or a workplace location every day that you may be exposed to who knows what. So that may be a factor in that as well. So some limitations of this study that are important to note for any future research that wishes to expand on the research pool of remote working as a whole is that my study here, the majority of participants were young white males. We can see from the graphs on the side here. Again, average age was 27.5 and 65.2 of the participants self-identified themselves as male. And before removing the 10 participants that were seen as invalid, 302 of the participants identified themselves as white. So the results I found here may differ from the same exact study if it's replicated again, if the only individuals measured were on the, let's say, older side of the working force, let's say average age of around 47, 50, may find very different results. So this is a good snapshot of the younger working force, majority male, majority white. Another important thing to note for this study is that it was conducted in a very unique time, the COVID-19 pandemic. So again, like I mentioned, we are in a very strange time where we feel way much safer at home than coming into the workplace every day. So those working remotely may feel a bit more of that emotional connection with the organization because it feels like, well, they're looking out for me still, they're allowing me to work from home. And we are about, as of this, 9 months or so into the pandemic. So we are very accustomed with interacting with loved ones, friends, families virtually, like this, over the phone, through the internet. And this is the same way that remote workers are interacting with their coworkers and supervisors. So for them, they're accustomed to this is how we interact right now. So once the pandemic ends and we go back to interacting with others face to face, in person, as much as we'd like, well, then now, if they go back to working remotely, it might start to feel a bit disconnected again. Although possibly not, this may become a new way to interact that doesn't meet that sort of isolation. So all things to keep in mind for possibilities of future research from here. And yes, I'd like to open it up to questions now. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Nico. Very clear presentation. Dave, would you like to ask Nico a question or provide a comment first?
Yeah, that was an excellent presentation, Nico. That was just really laid out nicely there.
Thank you.
Okay, so here's the question that I have for you, and so this is going a little beyond your study, more into the application of your study.
Sure.
So you're a consultant. You're having an initial contact with a CEO of a small company who has really high turnover, and he wants to know what you know that you can apply to help his company. What would you say? How would you advertise your expertise based on this study?
Oh, based on this study? Oh, that's a good question. My expertise would be on the That's a good question. I feel like I would want more information on the organization itself, but you're saying I'm going into an organization just almost cold, going into them then they're just asking
They've
me
contacted you, and this is they want to know your expertise. And
yeah, in terms of this study, my expertise is the understanding of how beneficial remote working structures can be for organizations, as long as an organization can be prepared to allow their supervisors the tools and resources that they need to give their employees the proper support that they would need to excel and connect, building up those sort of remote structures that allow them to have the flexibility to work on from their own locations, as well as being able to at the same time interact with their coworkers and supervisors as much as they need to gain that support and run things as efficiently as possible. Yeah, that's where the base of my expertise lies in terms of this study.
Okay, excellent.
Okay, and I'll just follow up on that. So you're currently working in HR, is that correct, Nico?
Yes. More specifically, the facet of recruiting.
Okay. So what would this mean for you in your organization and your current role right now? How would you apply aspects of this study?
I would apply mainly a reassurance to some of the management and leadership staff within my organization, because a lot of them right now have the trepidation where sometimes some of our employees do need to work remotely because of whether or not they are feeling a bit under the weather and they want to play it safe, or if they are traveling for a time being. And a lot of them, like I mentioned in the presentation, where they have a little bit of that preconceived notion where it's like, well, if they're working remotely, they're not going to be as effective because there's no one there kind of like watching them or keeping them accountable. But through the survey, we can see that as long as they are just given that initial support, that level of communication and open accessibility to information and any resources that they need, that they are going to be just fine. That they'll be able to still feel like commitments. It's not going to take them away from the organization. It's just going to allow them the flexibility to be able to work as they need to.
Okay. Okay.
There's a peace
So
of mind. Peace of mind.
yes. So one other question for you, Nico, how are you different today than when you started this program a few years ago?
Yeah. Wow. How am I different today? Um, I've been in this program for, I think it's been a couple years now. I think I started in 2018. It's 2020 now. Um, so I would say main part of it is a confidence factor. Um, I can recall my own experiences with panic attacks and anxiety. I was very prone to. This has forced me out of that, kind of like an exposure therapy type of deal. I remember having to just some months back, sometime last year in 2019, when I was working with the Boys and Girls Clubs in Garden Grove. And part of one of the classes was to present to your organization about really a broad range of topics that we can pick from. And and my organization was more than willing to help me out with it, which just made me more nervous. Like, okay, geez, they're putting a lot of a lot of trust into me now to present to their team, and they invited people from across all different branches to attend it. Um, but that was the first presentation I had where I felt like I took it in stride, where I had those nerves beforehand, of course, but I executed it almost as well as I could have possibly hoped. And that was the point where I realized, like, oh, I'm very different now. I went through the entire thing and I feel fine. I feel great about it. Yeah.
Mhm.
It's the confidence factor. Yeah.
Oh, well, good. That is actually one of the outcomes that we hope our students feel, that confidence and competence that they've
Yeah.
gained from the program. Well, good. Well, at this time, I'm going to stop the recording